during the Ice Age, could the Earth move through a dust cloud, enough dust would collect on top of the ice to destroy that reflective situation?
Well, I don't know, but an interesting, one of the ideas bandied about was if we started going into another ice age. This goes back in the 70s, when the fears were that we were perhaps headed for an ice age, right? This was before the fears of global warming. They were saying, well, if we start going into another ice age, is there anything we could do to mitigate its effects? And that one of them was like spreading carbon dust, on the ice to change its albedo so that it absorbs heat rather than reflects heat and presumably melt the ice. And in fact, that can actually be seen when volcanic dust or whatever, something like that, lands on ice and changes its albedo. It can change the whole dynamic of the glacier. It would require a lot of dust, but if we look at the effects, for example, at the end of the like if we look at this image right here, let me pull up this image, and we've talked about loess in here, haven't we? Okay, loess is this unique soil, topsoil, and I'm going to show you this slide of these rhythmites here, as they're called, hopefully coming up very soon. Yes. Okay, look at this slide, because this is a slide of catastrophically deposited mud layers associated with the melting of the great ice cap. And this is in Washington State, and this is this material that's like frosting layers over the hard basalt rock that lies beneath it. But the thing I'm going to call your attention to is that, well, first of all, let's look each of these layers. There's 39 counted layers from the bottom to the top right here. And of those 39 layers, each one is a layer deposited by a back flood coming in upstream into a valley, going to the end of the valley, slowing down, stopping, draining back off, and as it drains off, it leaves this layer of mud. Okay, the layer of mud lays there, and the next surge, back flood surge, comes up valley, flows up, reaches its maximum elevation, reverses direction, flows off, and leaves another layer of mud. This process was repeated at least 39 times in this exposure. After the last flood drained off, which would have been the uppermost layer that you can see right here, then something else came down within a very short period of time in like frosting on top of the mud layers, and it's this, a 6-foot thick layer of loess. Now that 6-foot thick layer represents the stuff that settled out of the atmosphere after the last flood. Now I want you to ponder, they say that, if you read the accounts of Mount St. Helens, people who were living in the vicinity of Mount St. Helens said that the sky turned as black as at midnight. And the layer of dust that was set down in the vicinity of the Mount St. Helens eruption was about 6 inches. The layer of ash, volcanic ash, was about 6 inches. This is about 6 feet. So what would that imply as to the atmospheric conditions, at least towards the end of this flooding episode?
Volcanoes all over the world.
Well, that's probably the result. That loess, well, if you start examining the constituent materials of the loess, you begin to find some very interesting stuff. Well, cosmic materials. Well, here's the thing about loess. It appears to have material both from within and from without. It appears, the argument all along has been, was it deposited by wind or by water? And there's two camps, and they've argued for 150 years and never resolved the argument. Well, exactly. See, what we're seeing here is a process where basically the entire atmosphere was saturated with this material. Nothing would have been able to live through this. If you survived the floods, that wouldn't have meant much, because you would have quickly been entombed within this loess as it's settled out. And as it turns out, we do find the remains of a lot of extinct mammals in loess deposits. Animals that probably did survive the flooding, only to succumb to the deposition of this material that was in the atmosphere.
So would you call that material ash? I know
well, it's.
But what is it really?
What is it really?
Yeah.
Well, it's
minerals.
yes, it's minerals. It's unusual stuff. It's got a lot of calcium carbonate in it.
That could be animal stuff.
Well, yes, but it seems to be focused on certain regions. Yes, like the Mississippi Valley has huge deposits of loess. You know, and then of course the whole Basalt plateau is, you know, frosted with layers of this stuff. In fact, there are layers of this stuff that existed before this succession of floods that are 200 feet thick.
Well, now the last time Yellowstone went off 76,000 years ago, where would that be representative in this? Would it be below this? Or
It would be below.
Huh?
It would be below.
Okay.
Yeah, more like 760.
Yeah, 760,000. If you look closely at the mud layers, you'll see basically horizontal or slightly tilted striations. If you look at the loess layer, what you see is a vertical structure. Let's see if we can see it in this. Here you can see now the horizontal layers, and then on top you see the loess deposits. And you can see the loess deposits have a vertical structure, and the material below has a horizontal structure. The material below was mud, a slurry of flood waters coming in. I say slurry because it would have been almost like liquid concrete, really, more than, you know, you're not going to see clear water. You're going to see this muddy material come in, and then it's going to flow out, and as it flows out, it leaves these successive layers. And then, of course, what finally capped the whole sequence is this 6-foot thick layer of loess. That, Don, actually, interesting question. That is one of the major unresolved controversies regarding the Missoula flood, is the time span between the layers. And the consensus now among most geologists with the U.S. Geological Survey is that there was about a century between each one. I disagree with that. Yes, and it's all based on their assumptions as to what caused the flood. And since I don't agree with their causal mechanism, I don't have to assume. See, as I've talked about repeatedly in here, the idea of what caused this flood was this giant ice-dammed lake. The ice dam gave way, a flood came down, then the ice dam resealed the valley, filled the lake again, the lake busted through, so they've calculated how long it would take to reseal the valley and fill the lake, and it takes about a century. So based on that assumption is why, Bill, you were here, right? Yeah.
You know, what we always said about this was that if it took a century in between those flood events, we should have seen tree stumps and other things.
Yes, but you do not. You do not. And I think that this, see, notice here's the scene that we looked at, and look what I've written. Burlingame Gully, Rosetta Stone of catastrophe. Do the layers represent many separate floods or multiple surges within one giant flood? I'm definitely leaning towards the one giant flood. But
What do you think? How many, like, years or like months? What do you think?
well, I would think it's just probably a matter of several days separating each one. And I have sound reasons for thinking that. Because in order for this back flood to occur, that means that downstream somewhere there has to be a constriction.
How far downstream? Wallula Gap.
Wallula Gap is right.
How many miles?
Not that far. Yes, Don.
Instead of having to refill the lake up there in Montana, it would only require filling the valley, and at that high rate of water, that would only take a few days to fill the Wallula Basin.
Yes. Now here, Charles. This is the map. The Burlingame Gully that we just saw is right here.
All right.
Okay. This is a basin, and all the floodwaters came from the north. But there's an anticline, a mountain range that crosses right here that was breached, right here. Now the question is, that's not resolved, is how much of that breaching took place. See, this is the Columbia River flowing down here, and it flows down through the Cascade Mountains in the Columbia Gorge. How many of you have ever driven down the Columbia Gorge? Isn't that magnificent? God, it's incredible. And did you realize when you were driving down it that gorge was created by this succession of these gigantic floods? Did you realize that the gorge that you drove down, this huge gorge, was filled with water? It was. In any case, right here is the breach point. And this is sort of like the Venturi flume, and all this water coming down from the north met up against this mountain range that was higher than the floodwaters. The floodwaters backed up behind this gap 1,000 feet deep. Right now we're the Tri-Cities area. These cities up in here, Kennewick and Pasco, they would have been under 1,000 feet of water. Okay, as the water rose, it backed up this way, and it reached beyond Walla Walla, the city of Walla Walla. Right here, where the Burlingame Gully is, where we saw the layers, that was about 600 feet. Ultimately, under the deepest flood layers, that was about 600 feet deep there. Where now it's farmers' fields, that was under 500 to 600 feet of water. Okay, so you got to also remember that this water is carrying millions of huge icebergs. Because where's the water coming from? Well, it's coming from the great ice sheet that was to the north of here that's being catastrophically broken up and melted. So these huge waves are coming down like tsunami waves, literally sweeping across the land. They're carrying thousands and thousands of these icebergs, and they're all coming down and trying to get through that gap at the same time. Major jam, major traffic jam, trying to get through that gap. Every time there's a major traffic jam, the water above rises. What happens as the water rises and gets deeper? What's going to happen, Charles?
It's going to cause the flood you're talking about.
Yes, but it's also going to increase the pressure on that gateway. And when the water gets deep enough, and apparently it was like 1,000 feet deep, enough pressure to push everything through.
That's 500 pounds per square inch.
It's about 500 pounds per square inch, right? And that's a hell of a lot of pressure.
That's huge.
That's a huge amount of pressure. And that 500 pounds PSI, you figure, multiply that by 144, and you've got how many pounds per square foot? That much pressure on anybody in here, with the possible exception of, I don't know, Sam, would probably turn us into just a pancake. Okay, so you got this 500 PSI pushing this. It pushes this stuff down through the gap. It forces it through. Okay, what happens when it forces through? The water suddenly just starts gushing through. Up here, the pond level, the water level falls. So as it falls and drains out this way, it leaves that layer of mud. Now, of course, the water, the ice cap is still breaking up and melting. So here's all of this more water coming in with more icebergs, and you have a succession of ice jams, water trying to drain through here, drain across the Cascades and get to the Pacific Ocean, because that's ultimately where it's going, the Pacific Ocean. So what you've got is this constant jerking motion of the water trying to force its way through here, and each one of those times the water falls, leaves a layer of mud, the next jam occurs, the water rises. When it drops again, it leaves another layer of mud. So from that succession, we can read off that there was at least 39 or more incidences of the water backing up behind that gap.
Do you think the mud was brought down by the glacier, or do you think the mud washed off from
Well,
local?
I think the mud washed off from the regional area. Yes, Don.
Okay, the average thickness of those layers was what, 2 to 3 feet?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, each time it would go down and deposit that mud, wouldn't it need to dry out first before the next deposit so that you could have a separate striation?
It would not have to completely dry out. No. I mean, see, here's the thing. As the water moves in, what's happening is the water, in the mainstream channel, the water's forceful. But in a flood, you've got these tributaries coming in, and the water backs up. And as it backs up, what's it doing? It's slowing down, isn't it? And it finally reaches a maximum depth, maximum backflood limit. then in the main channel, the floodwater falls, and then the water begins to flow back. But you see, what's happening here is when you get to the extent of that back flooding, the water flow is losing energy. It's losing the ability to transport material. And when you learn how to study paleohydrology and you're following the path of an ancient floodway, you can actually see that. When you look at a flood bar, you can immediately tell which way the water was coming from as it was slowing down. Because as it slows down, loses its velocity, it loses its capacity to carry material. So what's the first thing that's deposited out? The coarse material, the bigger stuff. And then as the water continues to slow down, lose velocity, it loses its carrying capacity. You see the size of the sediment getting progressively smaller. And so you can like look at a layer deposited by a flood, and you can tell which way it was coming from by going from coarse to fine. Okay? So what's happening here is you're getting close to the point where the water is slowing down, where it wants to stop and reverse direction. Well, right there, at the point where the water is slowing down, it's losing energy. So at some point, the regime changes from being erosional to depositional. You see what I'm saying? If the water is moving fast enough, it erodes and picks material up, which is a function of how fast it's moving. In fact, the question you ask can only be determined by a very close examination of the layers. And when you do a close examination of the layers, what you discover is that oftentimes there's interfingering. Like you can almost see where the currents of water came in and pulled up fingers of mud from the lower layer, and they're somewhat interspersed. And that tells me, too, that there was no long hiatus between each depositional layer. Because with it, think about that. If you go out, if we were to bulldoze Sam's front yard, okay, we come back 2 summers from now, is it still going to be bare dirt? No, of course not. What about 10 summers from now? 10 summers from now, trees are going to be coming up. 50 years to a century, there's going to be 20 and 30 foot tall trees out on that bare yard, right? See, if with this low energy floods coming in, like Bill said, there should be evidence that there was stuff growing there, entombed in these layers of mud, but there's not. And to me, that's a fatal flaw in the theory here. And I think that rather than some big ice-dammed lake, what we're actually seeing here is a trigger mechanism that caused this melting, that caused this flood, caused the collapse of the ice sheet, completely altered the climate regime of planet Earth, ended the Paleolithic Stone Age, inaugurated the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, ended the Clovis, inaugurated the Folsom, ended the Pleistocene, inaugurated the Holocene. From whichever way you look at it, from the geologist point of view, the paleontologists, the archaeologists, they all have come to the conclusion that something happened 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. But what they haven't agreed upon is that there's a single causal mechanism for all of it. And that's what I'm saying. And that single causal mechanism was extraterrestrial. It was cosmic in origin. Let me find a picture here and show you what the pre-flood Loess looked like. This one will show it to you. If you look at this, you'll notice that you've got these dark areas, and then here you've got the light areas, and you see the little squares? This is all agricultural right here. And all this agriculture is going on the Loess. Okay, when the floods came through, you can see the basalt rock, the volcanic rock, is this dark basalt. So when the floods came through, they washed away 50 to 100, up to 200 feet of the Loess topsoil and exposed the dark rock underneath. So here you've got this very fertile topsoil. Some of the most fertile topsoil on Earth is this Loess. And then you've got places where it's entirely stripped away. And then you've got the continuation of the Loess here. Before the flood, the Loess layer was continuous across here. You see? So there was a lot of loess deposited over this plateau during probably the last 4 or 5 ice ages. But at the end of the last ice age, something extremely traumatic happened with this great meltdown. And you had these tremendous floods coming off of the ice sheet and stripped away huge layers of the loess.
Where did this stuff come from you're talking about?
Which?
You said the loess got deposited.
Well, it came out of the atmosphere. But how it got into the atmosphere, that's the question. See, that right there, that's the question. Let me go to this one. By the way, what is that black thing down the upper left side?
Banks Lake.
No.
Like,
No. Lake Missoula doesn't exist anymore. Lake Missoula.
Columbia River?
No.
it's a cult.
It's the Caldera.
Yeah.
The Grand Coulee, yes.
Banks Lake's the top part of it.
Okay, here's the basalt plateau. And this area, look up here, this is the area of the basalt plateau. And here's Yellowstone over here. You see this? Now, the basalt plateau flowed out of the magma plume that's now under Yellowstone. So you see where Yellowstone is, right here, you can always identify it by Yellowstone Lake. 16 million years ago, this area of the continent was all the way over here. But in 16 million years, it's been pushed to the west this far. 16 million years ago, something happened where you suddenly had this huge outpouring of this lava, flow after flow after flow of this huge surges of this really liquid magma poured out and created this whole basalt plateau and actually flowed out to the Pacific Ocean, right over some of the Cascade Mountains. Okay, then over 16 million years, and it all flowed out from an area that is now right here. But this area used to be here. So the continent, the crust, has moved over the top of the magma plume, which is still there. How did the magma plume originally get there? Well, that's where I'm saying I think that a very plausible theory is that, you had a dense asteroid punch a hole in the Earth's crust at that point. Now,
I was reading an article the other day. They think that about all the diamond mines here on the Earth were created at the same time with a multiple.
really? Look at this. Now here, this is the Columbia River here, and this is the whole area of the basalt plateau, a couple of thousand square miles. And all the light areas is the Loess cap that was on this plateau of basalt lava rock, which is the dark stuff. The dark stuff got exposed as the big flood streams came off of the ice and swept over the plateau. I mean, when you look at this, can you see the branching pattern? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? There's no water flowing there now. I mean, there's a few residual lakes and stuff left behind in some of the scoured bedrock. So what we're seeing here is a cosmic event. And each element to this, as you look at it, is a clue to trying to reconstruct what it was. And I think the presence of that Loess is a very important clue as to what it was that happened here 13,000 years ago. So the question is there a periodicity?
Yes.
And is there a geography of this thing? Here's the motion that we're talking about, the precession of the Earth's axis. And where the pole, the North Pole, is pointing to now, I guess it would be this, yeah. Then that would be Polaris, and this would be Vega over here. And so this is the celestial pole, because the Earth is rotating, and if you were to go out and lay on the North Pole, and look straight over the zenith, straight over your head, That's what you'd be looking at, the pole star, the celestial pole. Right here would be the ecliptic pole, and that's the center of this circle, around which the precessional axis is, the precessional motion is taking it around that center. And here are the two planes that were the yellow line and the white line. The white line that was on the slide you saw was the celestial equator, and the yellow line was the ecliptic. And where they form that cross in space is this right here. And it's that X marks the spot that's moving with regards to the constellations. Now the question I'm raising is that X, as it moves against the backdrop of stars, is it somehow correlated with the timing of the influx of cosmic material? And here is, if you were looking at the sky from the North Pole, and here you see at the center of the circle is the ecliptic pole. Now you know what that means. Here's the present right here. So in the next century, the pole is shifting around this way. It'll intersect, come very close to Polaris, and then about 12,000 years from now, it's going to be up here close to Vega. So there's two ways we can measure the precessional motion of Earth's axis. One is by the changing orientation of Earth's poles, for example, the changing pole star, and the other is the drifting X marks the spot of the fall and spring equinoxes, which are moving at the same rate through the zodiac as that circle is moving. So this is a 26,000 year cycle, once complete around, just as the great year is a 26,000 year period that moves around. And it's that's divided into the 4 seasons that the ancient peoples associated with the succession of catastrophes. And I have come to have a lot of, acknowledge a lot of credibility to the ancient traditions. And if the ancient traditions seem to suggest that there was a periodicity, I would say it's worth a scientific investigation to try to confirm or refute the idea that there's periodicity within the succession of catastrophes. And science, as it turns out, seems to be supporting that contention. And there it is. There's the wheel. There's the wheel. And we are now, the vernal equinox is now transiting from Pisces into the sign of Aquarius. And if you follow that axis over to the other side, you see we're at the cusp of Virgo-Leo, and this is half the cycle ago, or 12,960 years. And so it turns out to be, to me, very coincidental that Richard Firestone of Berkeley Livermore and Alan West and Wendy Wolbach and the rest of this team of scientists that's been looking at the Pleistocene-Holocene boundary has now identified the layer of extraterrestrial substances, which include nanodiamonds, magnetic grains, microspherules, cosmogenic helium, layers of soot, etc. And what date do they give for that? What's the date that they give? 12,900 years. They've dated it precisely, 12,900 years. How long have we known that, Brad? How long have we known that, Jeremy?
So what is that now? What is the 12,900 years? It's the what?
Well, 12,900 years ago was the cosmogenic deposition that occurred.
Oh, okay.
Crash, boom, slam.
And here's how the ancients preserved that story. Because there's the cycle divided into the 4 ages, represented by the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the man. Every 6,480 years, they're suggesting something might happen. So what I'm now doing, and the work that I want to do in the near future, is to gather all of this new information that's come in about Holocene impacts. In other words, events that have happened in the last 12,000 years. Okay, if events have happened within the last 12,000 years, can they be, or last 26,000 years, can they be correlated with this right here? Can they be correlated with the passage of, through this cycle of the great year? And I would say yes. I would say yes.
The question though, as it moves around, is it only saying that those events occur when those four signs are it's called fixed cross?
Well, no.
Cross is available.
Notice, when was the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations? When did I say? Around 4,300 years ago, right? And we see that it's on a cusp right there. And that's one of the first slides I pulled up, was that celestial geometry of 4,300 years ago, right? When the X was transiting right across, almost hitting the Pleiades, and transiting right across the radiant center of the Taurid meteor shower. 4,300 years ago, that X that marks the spot was transiting the radiant point of the Taurid meteor shower right there. And that was when the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations occurred. There was a global something that happened, and it's been identified from all over the Earth, and it's been dated at 4,300 years ago. The termination of the Ice Age, the termination of the Clovis culture, associated with this black mat layer that I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, that black mat has been dated to precisely 12,900 years. We find that there was a sudden massive cold spike within the Holocene that occurred at 8,600 years. That's the date given. On the Greenland ice core climate change graph that I've showed you repeatedly, I've shown you a spike. And that spike is right here at this transition from Cancer to Gemini.
So each one of those divisions is probably something extraterrestrial.
Well, it would suggest that about every couple of thousand years there is some kind of a periodicity, some kind of a cycle. And the way I've described it is like this. If you are traveling through space or from here to wherever you're going to drive when you get home, and if there was no traffic lights at any of the intersections and everybody just sailed right through without slowing down, there'd be a lot of collisions, wouldn't there be? But the number of collisions would be totally dependent on how much traffic there was, right, in the cross streets. In other words, if you drove across, what's the name of this major, South Cobb? Okay, if you went out and you drove across South Cobb without stopping, would you rather do it at 4 in the afternoon or 4 in the morning? Obviously 4 in the morning. Your chances of getting T-boned would be considerably less than at 4 in the afternoon. Well, it's the same way. If there are these cosmic highways, which is what we're theorizing here, and these cosmic highways are populated with this cosmic material that's traveling through space, whenever our Earth crosses one of these cosmic highways, it's not necessarily foreordained that we're 100% certain to get hit. What is foreordained, though, is that the probabilities of something happening increase considerably compared to when we're not going through an intersection. You see what I'm saying?
So how many years is zero-year BP? What do you think? Is that 5, 10, 100 years from now? What do you think that is?
Well, that's the question. That's the question. And I don't think, I've never seen any explanation to my satisfaction that would indicate where that 0 point precisely is located.
Within 100 years?
Well, I don't know if there even is that precise location of a 0 point. I think it may be a range. Well, here, notice this tabulation of the Vedic ages. I believe that in order to try to discern whether or not there are these periodicities, we turn to the ancient records. And right here, you'll notice the third one down, the Treta Yuga, was 1,296,000 years. And that's what I was connecting with a hypothetical now. Don't go saying that Randall said that there is a blah, blah, blah. No, I'm proposing it as a theory to be tested, that Sirius could be close to a subgalactic orbital center. And Sirius's proper motion in the sky may be an indication of our actual motion relative to Sirius. Yes?
Yeah, I was just trying to do the math on that. So it seems that the great year, 25,920, goes into that, like almost exactly 50.
It does. Yes, it goes. See what Brad was saying.
50 of our
yes.
within one.
Here's what Brad was just thinking about. We're talking about the Earth doing this, and it takes 25,920 years to do a full cycle. Well, 50 of these exactly is the Treta Yuga, which is interesting because the number 50 seems... What?
50 of those?
50 of them.
And how many years is that?
That's one... 1,296,000 years would be 50 precessional cycles. And I've never seen anybody demonstrate that the ancient yugas, never, I've never seen this anywhere. Now this doesn't mean somebody somewhere in some obscure text hasn't made this connection, but I have never seen it. And I've done quite a bit of research where somebody has noted that the Treta Yuga is, that the cycle of the precession of the Earth's axis is actually embedded within this numerical scheme.
Well, aren't we supposed to be going from the Kali to the next one? You know, whenever that 0 point is?
Well, you know, there we get back to the 0 points, and nobody really knows. Nobody really knows.
The next 100 years.
Serious.
Are we in the Kali Yuga now, or what?
We're getting out of it. We're leaving
We're coming out of that one?
Yeah, we're going into the next one.
According to who?
To the Indian people who do this stuff.
Blavatsky writes about it.
Yeah.
What is it, Don?
What's the difference between it? It's 360 years, but what is a divine year? What makes it?
Well, in the Vedas, they were, again, you got to remember, cycles within cycles. So a divine year, okay.
360 human years.
Yeah, right, exactly. Duration, so 1,000 divine years is the Kali Yuga. And it's equivalent to 360,000 years. So 360 of our years was referred to as a divine year in the yugas. Would you like this as a handout?
Yeah, that would be great.
Oh, yeah.
I've wanted it ever since the first time we put it up there.
We want everything.
Oh, you did, huh? Well,
We'll put it under our pillows and then it'll just...
We'll absorb it.
We'll be so wise.
yeah, here's right quote from the Vayu Purana. 360 years, according to the human calculation, constitute one divine year. Wise people know that there are 4 yugas in Bharata Varsa. The first one is Karita, then follow Treta, Dvapara, and Kali. The notion of cyclically recurrent cosmic disasters. A catastrophe by flood, alternating with one by fire, has been traced from ancient Babylonia and Iran through Pythagorean and Stoic philosophy and from thence into the medieval world. This was written way back in 1963 by just a scholarly academic type who didn't necessarily think there was any scientific basis to any of it. But he did a lot of study. See, the Journal of the American Oriental Society, they did studies into ancient Oriental texts. This guy, Kennedy, these two people were prominent within that. They wrote an article that you can go get. You probably go over here to the the Theological Library at Emory, find the Journal of the American Oriental Society, which is where I found this. And this is what they're talking about. Cyclically recurrent cosmic disasters. This is an idea that was prevalent throughout the ancient world. In classical Greek and Hellenistic literature, the doctrine of the great year was already connected with the myths of the deluge and ekpyrosis. What's ekpyrosis again? Fire. Deluge is water. These catastrophes were supposed to return periodically when the planets came together in certain signs of the zodiac. Well, there it is right there. In the Persian system, we still find the deluge connected with a conjunction of the planets. Now, how would the deluge be connected with a conjunction of the planets? Well, precisely because it's those conjunctions of the outer planets that open the spillways to the cometary reservoir and allow that stream, that cosmic stream, to come into the sun. And when it does, Earth encounters that stuff. And when Earth encounters that stuff, things happen. That's the connection.
You're flipping through all this. You flip through the most interesting parts.
I know, but Sam is running us off.
This next week, or next time.
Start right in this area here next week.
No, start before.
Okay. Yeah, good stuff here. See, a parallel was drawn, now this from the ancient Iranian calendar. A parallel was drawn between the yearly and cosmic cycles. And to me, this has got to be one of the most important insights we get from this, is that they understood that there was this analogy between the lesser and the greater. And the greater would be so great that you can't observe the precession of the equinoxes in a human lifetime. It's too big, right? However, the cycles and the subcycles and the sub-subcycles are all in this resonant geometry where the larger is encapsulated in the smaller. And so by this idea of scale invariance, we can look at the smaller and understand the architecture of the greater. Does that make sense? All right.
Just like that thing I have on the ship. But you're
Bring it to a close.
Okay, well, we can stop there.